Welcome. You have made it to this quiet moment. As you settle in, let your breathing slow. Let the concerns of the day fade one by one. Tonight, we are travelling to a plateau in northern China, a landscape of yellow earth carved by wind over millions of years, a place where winter temperatures can fall far below freezing, where the air turns sharp and dry, where darkness comes early and stays long. For thousands of years, families lived here without electricity, without gas, without any of the heating systems we consider essential today. How did they sleep through these winters? How did they keep warm when the cold pressed in from every direction? The answer is not a single invention. It is a way of life, a combination of shelter, fire, ritual and tradition, refined across generations. Over the next while, we will move slowly through their world. We will see how Earth itself became shelter, how a single cooking fire warmed the night, how families prepared their bodies for sleep in a climate that did not forgive carelessness. So settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace. The Loess Plateau stretches across northern China. It covers an area of roughly 640,000 square kilometres. That is larger than France. The soil here is not ordinary dirt. It is loess, a fine, wind-deposited silt that has accumulated over millions of years. The grains are so small that when you hold a handful it feels almost like powder. Yet when compressed, this soil becomes remarkably stable. This yellow earth gives the region its name. The Yellow River flows through it, carrying the silt downstream, tinting the water a deep ochre. The hills and valleys are all the same pale gold colour, broken only by scattered vegetation. The climate here is defined by extremes. In summer, temperatures can climb above 35 degrees Celsius. In winter, they drop well below freezing. The difference between the hottest day of the year and the coldest night can exceed 60 degrees. Rain is scarce. The Loess Plateau lies in the rain shadow of mountain ranges to the south and west. Most precipitation falls in brief, intense summer storms. The rest of the year, the air is dry. This aridity has shaped everything about life here. Winter in this region is not just cold. It is persistently cold. The season lasts for months. Snow may fall, but often the cold is simply dry and penetrating. The wind comes from the north, sweeping down from Siberia and Mongolia, carrying air that has lost all its warmth over the vast interior of the continent. This wind is not a storm. It is a steady presence. It strips heat from anything exposed to it. Buildings, animals, human skin. The people who lived here understood this pressure. They knew that winter was not an event to be survived occasionally, but a recurring condition that demanded constant preparation. The Loess itself offered a solution. Because the soil is so fine and porous, it has a unique relationship with heat. It does not conduct temperature quickly. When the outside air grows cold, the soil does not immediately follow. When the sun warms the surface during the day, that heat does not penetrate deep. This property is called thermal inertia. Materials with high thermal inertia resist rapid temperature changes. They absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. For the people of the Loess Plateau, this meant that if they could surround themselves with enough earth, they could create a shelter whose interior temperature remained stable regardless of what happened outside. The solution was not to build on top of the earth, but to go into it. Across this region, families carved their homes directly into the cliffs and hillsides. They excavated rooms from the Loess, creating dwellings that were insulated by meters of soil on all sides. These homes are called yaodong. The word means cave dwelling, though that translation does not capture the sophistication of their design. A typical yaodong is not a natural cave. It is a carefully engineered space. The walls are vertical, the ceiling is arched, a shape that distributes the weight of the earth above and prevents collapse. The floor is level and often paved with brick. The entrance faces south when possible, to capture what little sunlight the winter offers. The interior extends back into the hillside, sometimes 10 or 15 meters deep. Because the walls are thick, often 2 meters or more of solid earth, the temperature inside a yaodong remains remarkably constant. In winter, when the outside air might be 20 degrees below zero, the interior stays around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. In summer, when the plateau bakes under the sun, the yaodong remains cool. This stability is not the result of any active heating or cooling. It is purely the thermal mass of the Earth itself, moderating the extremes. For a family preparing to endure a winter that could last 6 months, this baseline temperature made survival possible. 10 degrees is cold, but it is not lethal. It is a foundation upon which other strategies could build. The Yaodong did not solve the problem of winter entirely, but it transformed the problem. Instead of fighting air that was 20 or 30 degrees below freezing, the family now needed only to add enough warmth to make 10 degrees comfortable for sleep. That difference, between impossible and merely difficult, was everything. The Earth, patient and massive, became the first layer of protection. Winter in northern China begins with a change in the wind. In autumn, as the days shorten, a high-pressure system forms over Siberia and Mongolia. Cold air settles over the frozen interior of the continent, creating a vast dome of atmospheric weight. This system is called the Siberian High. It is one of the most powerful and persistent weather patterns on Earth. As the high-pressure zone strengthens, air begins to flow outward from its centre, seeking lower pressure. The nearest area of low pressure is to the south and east over the warmer lands of China. The result is a sustained wind from the north. This is the East Asian winter monsoon. It is not a monsoon in the sense of bringing rain. It is a reversal of the summer wind pattern, and it brings cold. The wind carries air that has been sitting over Siberia, where winter temperatures can reach 40 or 50 degrees below zero. By the time this air reaches the lowest plateau, it has warmed slightly, but it is still far below freezing. The wind is also dry. The air has travelled over thousands of kilometres of frozen land. There is no ocean to add moisture. This dryness makes the cold more penetrating. Humid air holds heat better than dry air. Dry air strips warmth from surfaces quickly. For the people living on the plateau, this wind was a constant fact of the winter life. It blew day after day, week after week. It found every crack in a wall, every gap around a door. It made being outside exhausting. Even walking a short distance required wrapping the face and hands. The wind's persistence also meant that any heat source had to work continuously. A fire that warmed a room for a few hours and then went out would leave the space vulnerable. The cold would flood back in immediately. This climate pattern was not new. It had shaped life in northern China for thousands of years. Historical records from the Wei and Jin dynasties, which ruled between the 3rd and 5th centuries, described winters that were even colder than those of the modern era. Average temperatures during that period were between 0.5 degree and 1 degree Celsius, lower than the baseline of later centuries. That may not sound significant, but in a region already at the edge of habitability, such a shift mattered. Crops that might barely survive one winter would fail in the next. Rivers that usually froze for a few weeks might remain frozen for months. Families that had managed with a certain level of preparation would find it insufficient. The response to this pressure was not panic or migration. It was refinement. The people of the plateau took the survival methods they already used and made them more efficient. They improved the design of their homes. They developed better ways to conserve heat. They created cultural practices that ensured warmth was distributed and managed carefully. The environment offered little room for error. A family that was careless about sealing their home, or that burned through their fuel supply too quickly, faced real danger. But the environment also offered materials and opportunities. The Liu's soil was abundant and easy to work. Agricultural waste, stalks, husks, dried plant matter could be used as fuel. The dry air meant that this fuel could be stored for long periods without rotting. The challenge was not the absence of resources, it was the efficient use of what was available. Winter on the Les Plateau was a test of organisation, of planning, of the ability to stretch limited resources across months of cold. The families who lived here developed a rhythm. In autumn, after the harvest, they prepared. They gathered fuel. They repaired their homes. They made or mended the padded clothing that would be needed. When the first cold winds arrived, the preparation phase ended. The family settled into the pattern of winter life. Routines became critical. Each day followed a similar arc. Work outside was minimised. Activities concentrated around the sources of warmth. The wind continued, the cold deepened. But inside the Yaodong, surrounded by earth, the family maintained a space that was survivable. The pressure from the north was relentless, but it was predictable, and what is predictable can be prepared for. The decision to carve a home into the earth was not born from preference, it was a response to necessity. On the Los Plateau, traditional building materials were scarce, timber was limited. The region had been deforested over centuries of habitation. Stone suitable for construction was rare. Brick could be made, but it required fuel to fire, and fuel was needed for heating and cooking. The earth, however, was everywhere, and the specific properties of loess made it uniquely suited for excavation. When dry, less is soft enough to dig with hand tools. A family could carve out a room using shovels and simple implements. The work was labour-intensive, but it required no special equipment or materials. Once exposed to air, the loess hardens. The fine particles compact and bond together, forming a stable surface. This meant that a carved wall did not need reinforcement. The earth supported itself. The construction of a yaodong began with choosing a site. The ideal location was a cliff face or steep hillside oriented to the south. Southern exposure allowed the low winter sun to reach the entrance, providing light and a small amount of passive warmth. The builders marked the outline of the entrance on the cliff face. The entrance was typically rectangular, about 2 meters wide and 2.5 meters high. From this opening they began to dig inward. The shape of the interior was critical. A flat ceiling would be prone to collapse under the weight of the earth above. Instead, the ceiling was arched. This distributed the load evenly across the walls and into the ground. The arch was not a perfect semicircle. It was slightly elliptical, rising to a peak about 3 meters above the floor. This shape provided headroom while maintaining structural integrity. As the excavation progressed, the workers removed the soil in baskets or carts. This spoil was not wasted. It was used to build retaining walls around the entrance, or to create level terraces for farming. The depth of a yaodong varied depending on the intended use and the stability of the soil, but most extended 10 to 15 meters into the hillside. This depth ensured that the living space was fully surrounded by earth, with at least 2 meters of soil on all sides. The floor was levelled and often paved with bricks or compacted earth. The walls were smoothed. In many cases, the interior surfaces were coated with a thin layer of lime plaster. This brightened the space and made it easier to keep clean. Windows were rare in traditional yaodong. The only significant opening was the entrance. This meant the interior was dim, lit primarily by whatever sunlight entered through the doorway, and by oil lamps or candles at night. The dimness was not seen as a drawback. It contributed to the thermal stability. A large window would allow heat to escape rapidly. There were 3 main types of yaodong, each adapted to the local terrain. The cliffside yaodong was the most common. It was carved horizontally into a vertical or near-vertical cliff face. The entrance opened directly onto a slope or valley floor. These dwellings took advantage of natural topography, requiring no excavation beyond the living space itself. The sunken courtyard yaodong was used in flatter areas where cliffs were not available. The builders first excavated a large square pit, typically 6 to 10 meters deep. This created an artificial courtyard surrounded by vertical walls. The living quarters were then carved into the 4 sides of this pit, facing inward toward the courtyard. This design created a microclimate. The courtyard itself was sheltered from the wind. The entrances to the rooms faced into this protected space, rather than directly into the open air. The third type was the hoop yaodong. This was a hybrid structure. Instead of carving into the earth, builders constructed an arched framework using brick or stone on flat ground. They then covered this framework with a thick layer of soil. The hoop yaodong replicated the thermal properties of a natural cave dwelling, but could be built anywhere. It was more labour-intensive than a carved yaodong, requiring both materials and skill in masonry. But it offered flexibility in site selection. All 3 types shared the same fundamental principle. They surrounded the living space with a massive layer of earth, using the thermal inertia of the soil to buffer against temperature swings. The interior temperature of a yaodong did not follow the daily or even weekly weather. It responded to the average temperature over months. In winter, this meant the yaodong stayed warmer than the outside air. In summer, it stayed cooler. For a family settling in for the winter, this was the foundation of survival. The yaodong did not provide comfort on its own. 10 degrees Celsius is too cold to sleep without additional warmth, but it provided a stable baseline. Inside the earth, surrounded by 2 meters of yellow soil, the family was insulated from the worst of the northern wind. The temperature would not spike or plummet. It would remain steady. From that stability, everything else became possible. The landscape of the Les Plateau is not uniform. In some areas, steep valleys cut through the soil, creating cliffs that rise dozens of meters. In other places, the land is gently rolling or nearly flat. Each type of terrain required a different approach to shelter. The cliffside yaodong was the simplest to construct where the geography allowed it. The builder needed only to find a cliff face with the right orientation and stability, and then begin carving. These dwellings were often built in clusters. A single cliff face might house 10 or 20 families, each with their own excavated room. The entrances were aligned horizontally, creating a row of arched openings that looked, from a distance, like a honeycomb. This clustering had practical advantages. It allowed families to share resources. If one household needed help with construction or repairs, neighbours were close at hand. In winter, the proximity meant that news and assistance could be shared without long journeys through the cold. The cliffside yaodong also benefited from the natural drainage of the slope. Rain and snowmelt flowed downward, away from the entrances. This reduced the risk of water seeping into the living space, but not all families had access to suitable cliffs. In flatter regions, the solution was the sunken courtyard yaodong. This type required more initial labour. The builders first excavated a large pit, square or rectangular, 6 to 10 metres deep. The walls of the pit were cut vertically, creating a hidden courtyard below ground level. Once the pit was complete, the builders carved the living quarters into the 4 vertical faces, just as they would into a natural cliff. Each face of the courtyard might hold 1 or 2 rooms, depending on the size of the family. A ramp or staircase provided access from ground level down into the courtyard. This entrance could be narrow and was sometimes covered with a roof to keep out snow. The courtyard itself became the centre of the household. It was protected from the wind. Sunlight reached the bottom during the middle of the day. The family could perform outdoor tasks, hanging laundry, preparing food, repairing tools, in relative shelter. In winter, the courtyard acted as a buffer zone. Cold air would settle into the pit, but because the pit itself was surrounded by earth, the temperature was less extreme than on the open plateau. The doorways to the living quarters opened into this moderated space, not into the full force of the exterior climate. The sunken courtyard yaodong was particularly common in areas where the soil was stable, but the terrain lacked natural cliffs. It represented a significant investment of labour, but once complete, it provided a secure and efficient dwelling that could be used for generations. The hoop yaodong was the rarest of the 3 types, but it had unique advantages. Construction began with laying a foundation on flat ground. The builders then erected a series of arches using brick or stone. These arches formed the skeleton of the structure, defining the shape of the rooms. Once the arches were in place, the builders covered them with a thick layer of compacted earth. This layer was at least 1 metre deep, sometimes more. The earth was packed tightly and sloped to shed water. The result was a structure that looked, from the outside, like a low earth mound. The entrance was a doorway set into one end of the mound, leading into the arched interior. The hoop yaodong required more materials than a carved dwelling. Bricks had to be made or purchased. Skilled masons were needed to construct the arches, but it could be built in locations where excavation was not feasible, where the soil was too loose, or where the groundwater level was too high. It also allowed for greater control over the interior layout. A family could design the exact dimensions and arrangement of rooms, rather than being constrained by the natural contours of a cliff or pit. Despite their differences, all 3 types of yaodong served the same function. They used the thermal mass of the earth to create a stable interior environment. The thickness of the soil cover was critical. A thin layer, less than 1 metre, would not provide sufficient insulation. The exterior temperature changes would penetrate too quickly. A 2-metre layer, however, created a time lag of several months. Heat from the summer would still be slowly radiating inward in early winter. Cold from the winter would still be dissipating inward in early summer. This meant that the interior of a Yaodong was always out of sync with the outside world. It was cooler in summer and warmer in winter than the exterior air, not because of any active heating or cooling, but simply because of the slow movement of heat through the earth. For the families living in these structures, this stability was the foundation of everything else. It was the baseline upon which all other strategies for warmth and survival were built. The Yaodong was not just shelter, it was a tool, a thermal battery carved from the yellow earth, holding the average temperature of the year inside its walls, offering refuge from the extremes outside. Heat moves. It flows from warmer areas to cooler areas, always seeking equilibrium. This movement can happen in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact. When you place your hand on a cold metal railing, heat flows from your skin into the metal. You feel the cold because warmth is leaving your body. Convection is the transfer of heat through the movement of fluids, air or water. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. This creates circulation patterns that distribute heat or cold through a space. Radiation is the transfer of heat through electromagnetic waves. The sun warms the earth through radiation. A fire warms your face from across a room the same way. In a typical house built above ground with thin walls, all three forms of heat transfer work against warmth in winter. Heat conducts through the walls. Cold air infiltrates through gaps and cracks, creating convection currents. The interior radiates warmth outward into the cold night. The Yaodong resists all three. Conduction through the walls is slow because the walls are thick and because Loess has low thermal conductivity. The soil does not move heat efficiently. A 2-metre wall of a loess acts as a significant barrier. The heat loss through such a wall is gradual, measured not in hours but in weeks or months. Convection is minimised because the Yaodong has few openings. There is one entrance. There are no chimneys in the living space itself. Cold air cannot circulate freely through the dwelling, as it would in a house with multiple windows and doors. Radiation is reduced because the interior walls are earthen, and earth does not radiate heat away as quickly as materials like brick or stone that have been fired at high temperatures. The result is a space where the temperature changes very slowly. This principle is called thermal inertia. It is a measure of how resistant a material or structure is to temperature change. A structure with low thermal inertia, a tent for example, will quickly match the outside temperature. Put up a tent on a cold night, and within an hour the inside will be nearly as cold as the outside. A structure with high thermal inertia resists this change. The Yaodong has very high thermal inertia because of the sheer mass of Earth surrounding it. To understand this, consider what happens to heat over the course of a year. In summer, the surface of the Loess plateau is warm. Sunlight heats the ground. This warmth begins to conduct into the soil, moving downward and inward. But heat moves slowly through Earth. The warmth from a summer day might only penetrate a few centimetres into the soil. The warmth from an entire summer, accumulated over months, might reach a depth of 1 or 2 metres by the time autumn arrives. By the time winter comes, the surface is cold again. The air temperature has dropped below freezing. But the soil at depth still holds the residual warmth from summer. That warmth is slowly radiating outward, but the process takes months. Inside a Yaodong, surrounded by 2 metres of earth, the interior temperature is influenced by the average of the entire year. It is not tied to the current day, or even the current month. In the depths of winter, when the outside air might be 20 degrees below zero, the soil 2 metres deep is still holding on to some of the warmth from the previous summer. The interior of the Yaodong benefits from this stored heat. In the same way, in the height of summer, when the surface is baking under the sun, the soil at depth is still cool from the previous winter. This is why a Yaodong maintains a temperature around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius year-round. That range represents the average annual temperature of the region, filtered through the slow thermal response of the Earth. For a family preparing for winter, this stability was essential. It meant that the interior temperature would not swing wildly. There would be no sudden drops, no mornings waking to find the room had frozen overnight. The cold was constant, but it was manageable. Of course, 10 degrees is still too cold for comfort. A person cannot sleep well at that temperature without additional warmth, but it is far above the lethal range. It is a foundation that can be built upon. The Yodong solved the problem of extremes. It removed the danger of the air temperature dropping to 20 or 30 below zero inside the living space. What remained was the need to add enough warmth to make that baseline of 10 degrees into something livable. Enough warmth to allow sleep. Enough warmth to prevent the slow drain of body heat that leads to hypothermia over the course of a long winter night. The Yodong did not heat the home. It simply held the line, keeping the interior stable, while the world outside fluctuated wildly. That was enough. From that steady platform, the family could use other methods to create the additional warmth they needed. The earth, massive and patient, absorbed the violence of the climate and returned only stillness. The entrance to a Yodong was its only significant opening to the outside world. There were no windows in the traditional sense, no glass panes looking out onto the plateau. The living space extended deep into the hillside, far from any exterior wall that might accommodate an opening. Light entered through the doorway. During the day, sunlight would penetrate a few meters into the room, illuminating the area near the entrance. The back of the dwelling remained in shadow. This dimness was intentional. Every opening is a point of heat loss. A window allows warmth to escape through conduction, through the glass itself, and through inevitable gaps around the frame. In winter, windows become cold surfaces that radiate chill into the room. By eliminating windows, the Yodong minimized these losses. The thermal envelope remained intact, but the entrance still required careful attention. A simple open doorway would allow cold air to pour in continuously. The family needed a barrier that could be opened and closed, that would resist the wind, and that would not itself conduct cold into the living space. The solution, developed over centuries, was a combination of wooden doors and specialized paper. The door frame was set into the carved earth at the entrance. It was usually made from wood, though wood was scarce and valuable. The frame had to be sturdy enough to support the door and to anchor into the loess without shifting. The door itself was constructed from wooden planks, fitted tightly together. In wealthier households, the door might be reinforced with crossbeams and metal fittings. In poorer families it was simpler, just planks held together with wooden pegs. But even a solid wooden door was not enough. Wood conducts heat more readily than earth. A wooden door, especially one exposed to the northern wind, would grow cold. That cold would radiate into the room. The additional protection came from the window lattice and paper. Above or beside the door, a wooden lattice frame was installed. This frame was divided into small geometric sections by thin wooden strips. The pattern was both decorative and functional. It created a grid of small openings. Over this lattice, paper was applied. The paper was not ordinary. It was made from the inner bark of the paper mulberry tree, a plant that had been cultivated in China for this purpose for centuries. The fibres were long and strong. When processed correctly, the resulting paper was surprisingly durable. But paper alone would not survive the winter. Rain, snow, and ice would destroy it. Wind would tear it. To make the paper weather-resistant, it was treated with tung oil. This oil came from the seeds of the tung tree. When applied to paper and allowed to dry, it formed a waterproof coating. The paper became translucent, allowing light to pass through while blocking wind and moisture. The oiled paper was pasted onto the wooden lattice. The small sections of the lattice meant that even if one section of paper tore, the damage would be limited to that section. Repairs could be made by replacing individual pieces rather than the entire covering. This combination, wood, lattice and oiled paper, created a barrier that was wind-resistant and water-resistant, yet still allowed soft, diffused light to enter the room. The light that came through oiled paper was gentle. It lacked the harsh brightness of direct sunlight through glass. The interior remained dim, but not completely dark. On a clear winter day, there was enough light near the entrance to work by. In regions with particularly harsh winters, an unusual practice developed. Families pasted the paper on the outside of the lattice rather than the inside. This seems counterintuitive. Paper on the outside is more exposed to the elements. It would seem to need more frequent replacement. But in areas with heavy snowfall, interior pasting created a problem. Snow would accumulate in the recesses of the lattice on the outside. During the day, when the sun came out, this snow would begin to melt. Water would seep into the wood and into the edges of the paper. At night, the water would freeze again. This cycle of melting and freezing would rot the wood and degrade the paper rapidly. By pasting the paper on the outside, the lattice was covered. The surface became smooth and taut. Snow could not accumulate in crevices. It would slide off or could be brushed away easily. The paper took the brunt of the weather, but it could be replaced each season without damage to the underlying structure. This practice became so distinctive in the northeastern regions of China that it was known as one of the three wonders of that area. It was a small adaptation, but it demonstrated the level of attention given to every detail of winter survival. The entrance and its coverings were maintained carefully. Before winter set in, the family would inspect the paper. Any torn or weakened sections were replaced. The wooden frame was checked for gaps or cracks. Anything that might allow cold air to infiltrate was sealed. Once winter began, the door was opened only when necessary. Going outside to gather water, to retrieve stored food, to tend to animals, these tasks were done quickly. The door was closed immediately afterward. At night, the door was shut tight. Sometimes an additional layer of fabric or felt was hung behind it, creating a second barrier against the cold. Inside, the family relied on oil lamps for light. These were simple vessels, usually ceramic, filled with vegetable oil and fitted with a wick. The light they produced was dim and flickering, but it was sufficient for the limited tasks of winter evenings. The lamps also produced a small amount of heat. Not enough to warm the room, but every bit of warmth mattered. Nothing was wasted. The dimness of the Yaodong interior became part of the rhythm of winter life. The family rose with the dawn when light began to filter through the oiled paper. They worked during the daylight hours. As the sun set, they prepared for the evening meal, and afterward, activities slowed. There was less to do in winter. The fields were frozen. Animals required minimal care. The long dark hours were spent in rest or in quiet work that could be done by lamplight, mending clothes, preparing tools for spring, telling stories. The architecture of the Yaodong shaped the pattern of daily life. The single entrance, the dim interior, the need to conserve fuel for lamps, all of it encouraged stillness. And in that stillness, the family conserved energy. Not just the energy of fuel, but the energy of their own bodies. Movement generates heat, but it also requires food. In winter, when food supplies were limited, unnecessary activity was avoided. The dim, quiet interior of the Yaodong was not a hardship. It was part of the strategy of survival. The light that came through the oiled paper was enough. The darkness that followed sunset was expected. The family adapted their rhythms to match the constraints of their environment. The Yaodong, half buried in the earth, lit by soft, filtered daylight and dim oil lamps, became a place of quiet endurance. A shelter not just from the cold, but from the relentless demands of the exterior world. In the centre of the Yaodong's main room, occupying nearly half of the floor space, stood the kang. It was not a piece of furniture, it was a structure. A platform built from brick and clay, raised about 1/2 metre above the floor. Its dimensions were substantial, 3 metres long, nearly 2 metres wide. The kang was the most important feature of the home. It served more functions than any other element of the dwelling. During the day, it was a workspace. The family sat on it to prepare food, to mend clothing, to sort seeds for the next planting. Its height made it a convenient surface for tasks that required sitting. It was also the dining area. Meals were eaten here, with the family sitting cross-legged on the platform, bowls and dishes arranged between them. It was the social centre. When neighbours visited, they were invited to sit on the kang. Conversations happened here. Decisions were made here. And at night it became the bed. The entire family slept on the kang side by side under shared quilts, but the kang was more than a multi-purpose platform. It was a heating system, the most efficient heating system developed in traditional Chinese architecture. The design of the kang was based on a simple principle. The family needed to cook. Cooking required fire. Fire produced heat and smoke. Instead of allowing that heat and smoke to escape directly outside, the kang captured it and used it to warm the sleeping surface. The system consisted of 3 main components. The first was the stove, called the zao. This was built into one end of the kang, usually the end closest to the entrance of the Yaodong. The stove had a firebox where fuel was burned and a flat-top surface with openings for pots and woks. The second component was the kang body itself, the hollow platform. Inside the platform was a network of flues. These were channels built into the structure, running beneath the surface where the family would sleep. The third component was the chimney, positioned at the far end of the kang. This created a draft that pulled air through the system. When the family lit a fire in the stove to cook a meal, the flames heated the pots directly. But the hot smoke and gases did not go straight up a chimney above the stove. Instead, they were forced to travel horizontally through the flues inside the kang. As the smoke moved through these channels, it transferred heat to the brick and clay surrounding the flues. This material, dense, heavy, and thick, absorbed the thermal energy. The smoke eventually reached the chimney at the far end and was vented outside. But by that point, much of its heat had been left behind, stored in the mass of the kang. This stored heat then radiated upward through the surface of the platform and downward into the room. The kang became warm to the touch. The efficiency of this system was remarkable. Studies conducted in the 20th century found that well-maintained kangs could recover up to 64% of the heat energy from the fuel. This was far higher than a simple open fire, where most heat escapes directly up a chimney or disperses into the air. The kang's efficiency came from maximising contact between the hot gases and the thermal mass. The longer the smoke travelled through the flues, the more heat it gave up. Some kang designs use serpentine flue paths, doubling back on themselves to extend the contact time. But the design had to be carefully balanced. If the flue path was too long or too narrow, the draft would be insufficient. Smoke would back up into the room. If the path was too short or too wide, the smoke would pass through too quickly, carrying its heat away before it could be absorbed. Traditional kang builders learned these principles through experience. The exact dimensions of the flues, the number of turns, the height of the chimney, all of these were calibrated to work together. Once the fire died down after the evening meal, the kang retained its heat. The thermal mass continued to radiate warmth for hours. The temperature of the kang surface varied depending on the intensity of the fire and the design of the flues, but it typically remained warm enough to be comfortable for 5 hours or more. In some cases, a well-built kang fired in the evening would still be detectably warm the following morning. This meant that the family did not need to keep a fire burning through the night. They cooked their evening meal, and the kang stored enough heat to keep them warm while they slept. This was critical in an environment where fuel was limited. Every piece of wood, every handful of straw, every dried cornstalk had to be used as efficiently as possible. The kang allowed the family to get double use from their fuel. It cooked their food and warmed their bed with the same fire. The construction of a kang required skill. The flue channels had to be built correctly, with smooth surfaces and proper dimensions. The materials had to be chosen carefully. Brick was common, as it held heat well and was durable. In areas where brick was unavailable, compacted clay could be used, though it required more frequent maintenance. The surface of the kang was sometimes finished with a layer of adobe or a coating of lime. This created a smooth sleeping surface and helped to seal any small cracks that might allow smoke to leak into the room. Maintenance was essential. Over time, the flues could become clogged with soot and ash. This reduced the efficiency of heat transfer and could impede the draft. Families would periodically clean the flues, accessing them through small openings built into the structure. The kang was not moved. It was a permanent fixture. When a family built or moved into a yaodong, constructing the kang was one of the first tasks. A yaodong without a kang was uninhabitable in winter. The platform's size meant that it dominated the room. There was little space for other furniture, but this was not seen as a problem. The kang itself provided all the surface area the family needed. In the dim interior of the yaodong, the kang was both physical and symbolic centre. It was where warmth was created and shared. It was where the family gathered. It was the anchor of daily life. Without the kang, the yaodong would have been merely a cold cave. With it, the cave became a home. The process of heating the kang began in late afternoon, as the family prepared their evening meal. Fuel for the stove was gathered earlier in the day. In rural northern China, wood was scarce. Forests had been cleared over centuries. What trees remained were often protected or reserved for construction. The primary fuel was agricultural waste. After the autumn harvest, fields were covered with the dried remnants of crops, stalks of millet, wheat, corn and sorghum. These stalks were gathered, bundled, and stored in dry spaces. Other materials were also used: dried grass, leaves, husks from threshed grain. In some households, dried animal dung was collected and shaped into cakes, then left to harden in the sun. These materials were not high-quality fuels. They burned quickly and produced less heat than wood, but they were abundant and renewable. Each year's harvest provided the next year's fuel supply. The family brought the fuel to the stove in manageable amounts. Too much at once would create excessive smoke. Too little would not generate sufficient heat for cooking. The fire was lit in the firebox at the front of the stove. Kindling was used first, small dry twigs or straw. Once this caught, larger pieces of stalk were added. The flames rose quickly. The flat top of the stove had circular openings where pots and woks could be placed directly over the fire. The family positioned their cooking vessels and began to prepare the meal. Cooking was a practical task, but it was also the means by which the kang was charged with heat. The two functions were inseparable. As the fire burned, flames licked the underside of the cooking pots. The food heated. Rice or millet was boiled. Vegetables were stir-fried. Soups were brought to a simmer. At the same time, hot smoke and gases from the fire were being drawn into the entrance of the flue system. This entrance was positioned just behind the firebox, at the beginning of the kang platform. The draft created by the chimney at the far end of the kang pulled the smoke through the channels. This draft was essential. Without it, smoke would spill into the room, making the space unlivable. The strength of the draft depended on several factors. The height of the chimney mattered. A taller chimney created stronger suction. The temperature of the smoke mattered. Hotter smoke rose more readily, enhancing the draft. Even the outside air temperature had an effect. On very cold days, the temperature difference between inside and outside was greater, which strengthened the draft. Inside the kang, the smoke travelled through a series of passages. These were typically rectangular channels, about 10 to 15 centimetres wide and tall. The walls of the channels were made from brick or compacted clay. As the smoke moved through these passages, it came into contact with the walls. Heat transferred from the hot gases to the solid material through conduction. The brick absorbed the energy. The smoke cooled as it gave up its heat. By the time it reached the chimney, it was significantly cooler than when it entered the flue system. This cooling was visible. Smoke entering the flues was often hot enough to glow faintly, while smoke exiting the chimney was dark and cool. The absorbed heat spread through the mass of the kang. Brick and clay are not perfect conductors, but over the course of half an hour to an hour, the warmth distributed itself throughout the structure. The surface of the kang began to warm. The section nearest the stove heated first and became the warmest. The section near the chimney, where the smoke had already cooled, remained less warm. This created a temperature gradient across the length of the platform. The difference might be 10 or 15 degrees Celsius from one end to the other. The family was aware of this gradient. They understood where the warmth was concentrated and where it was milder. This knowledge shaped how they used the kang, both during the day and at night. After the meal was cooked, the fire was not immediately extinguished. Sometimes the family would add a bit more fuel to extend the heating period. The goal was to ensure that the kang absorbed as much heat as possible before the fire died. Once the cooking was finished and the pots were removed, the stove was allowed to burn down. The remaining coals gradually gave up their heat. The smoke thinned and eventually stopped, but the kang itself remained warm. The thermal mass, all that brick and clay, held the energy that had been transferred to it. It released this energy slowly, radiating it upward into the room and into the bodies of the people sitting or lying on its surface. The rate of heat release depended on the temperature difference between the kang and its surroundings. In the early evening, when the kang was hottest and the room coolest, the heat flow was more rapid. As the night progressed and the kang cooled, the rate slowed. But because the mass was so large, the cooling process took hours. 5 hours was typical for a well-built kang fired with a good supply of fuel. Some kangs could retain detectable warmth for 8 hours or more. This slow release was ideal for sleep. The family did not need intense heat through the night. They needed moderate, steady warmth that would keep them from losing body heat to the cold room. The kang provided exactly that. It was a thermal reservoir charged in the evening and drawn upon through the night. The system required no ongoing attention once the fire was out. There was no need to wake in the middle of the night to add fuel. The heat was already stored, and it would last until morning. The path of the smoke, from fire through flues to chimney, was a path of energy transfer. Heat moved from combustion into solid mass, where it was held and slowly released. This process repeated every day through the winter. Evening after evening, the family cooked their meal and charged the kang. Night after night, they slept on the warmth that remained. The routine was predictable, the outcome was reliable, and in a climate that offered little margin for error, that reliability was itself a form of security. The kang was not a new invention. Its fundamental design had been in use for more than 2,000 years. Archaeological evidence of early heated sleeping platforms appears in sites from the Han Dynasty, which ruled China from the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century CE. These early versions were simpler than later designs, but the basic principle was already in place. Over centuries, the design was refined. Builders learned to optimize the flue paths. They discovered which materials retained heat longest. They developed methods for sealing the structure to prevent smoke leakage. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, roughly 1,000 years ago, the kang had become a standard feature of homes in northern China. It was not limited to the low Earth plateau. Variations of the kang were used across the northern regions, from Manchuria to the highlands of Shaanxi. But the kang reached its fullest expression in the lowest regions, where fuel scarcity and extreme winter cold made efficiency essential. The efficiency of the kang was measurable. In the late 20th century, when researchers began to study traditional heating systems, they conducted tests on rural kangs to determine how much of the fuel's energy was actually used. A simple open fire burning in the centre of a room might deliver only 20 to 30% of its heat into the space. The rest escapes through the chimney or is lost to the outside air. A kang, by contrast, captured between 60 and 65% of the heat energy from the fuel. This was a remarkable improvement. It meant that the same amount of fuel could provide more than twice as much usable warmth. This efficiency came from two factors. First, the hot smoke was forced to travel through a long path in close contact with a large surface area of brick. This maximised heat transfer before the smoke was vented. Second, the heat was stored in a material with high thermal capacity. Brick and clay can absorb large amounts of heat without a corresponding large increase in temperature. They act as a buffer, soaking up energy and releasing it gradually. The mass of a typical kang was significant. A platform 3 meters long, 2 meters wide, and half a meter high, constructed from brick, would weigh well over a ton. This mass meant that even a modest fire could raise the temperature of the kang by a useful amount, and once raised, that temperature would decay slowly. The specific heat capacity of brick is roughly 1/5 that of water. This means that it takes 1/5 as much energy to raise the temperature of a kilogram of brick by 1 degree as it does to raise a kilogram of water by the same amount. But brick is much denser than water, and the kang's mass was enormous. The total heat capacity of the kang was therefore very large. A fire that burned half a kilogram of dry straw might release about 8,000 kilojoules of energy. If 60% of that energy was absorbed by the kang, the platform gained nearly 5,000 kilojoules. For a kang with a mass of 1,000 kilograms and a specific heat of roughly 800 joules per kilogram per degree, this would raise the average temperature of the structure by about 6 degrees Celsius. If the kang started at the ambient temperature of the Yaodong, say 10 degrees, it would reach 16 degrees. The surface, in contact with the hottest flues, might reach 25 or even 30 degrees. Over the course of the night, that heat would radiate into the room and into the bodies of the sleeping family. The kang would cool, but slowly. These are rough estimates, and actual performance varied based on many factors: the quality of the fuel, the design of the flues, the ambient temperature, the insulation of the Yaodong, but the principle held. The kang transformed a small amount of fuel into hours of warmth. This was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. Fuel had to last through the entire winter. If a family burned through their stored stalks and husks too quickly, they would face the coldest months with nothing to burn. That could mean death. The kang allowed the family to stretch their fuel supply. Because it was so efficient, they needed less fuel per night. The same stockpile that might last 2 months with an open fire could last 4 months with a kang. This margin was critical. Winters on the Loess Plateau could extend from October to March. 6 months. If the harvest had been poor, or if the family was large, or if the winter was unusually cold, fuel could run short. Efficiency was not an abstract concept. It was the difference between making it to spring and running out of warmth in February. The kang also concentrated heat where it was needed most. Heating an entire room to a comfortable temperature would require an enormous amount of fuel. The room would also lose that heat rapidly through the walls and entrance. But the kang did not try to heat the room. It heated the platform, and the family slept on the platform. This localized heating was far more efficient. The heat was delivered directly to the bodies that needed it through conduction and radiation. The air in the room might remain cool, but the people were warm. This is a fundamental principle of thermal comfort. The human body does not need the surrounding air to be warm. It needs to avoid losing heat faster than it can generate it. Lying on a warm surface prevents heat loss through conduction. Being surrounded by warm air prevents heat loss through convection. Being near a warm radiating surface prevents heat loss through radiation. The kang provided all three. The surface was warm. The air immediately above the surface was warmed by convection. The mass of the kang radiated heat upward. Together, these effects created a microclimate on the surface of the platform. Even if the room was near freezing, the space where the family slept could be 15 or 20 degrees warmer. This microclimate was the envelope of survival. Inside it, the family could sleep. Outside it, they would lose body heat through the night and wake cold, stiff, and at risk of hypothermia. The kang, simple in concept but refined over millennia, made that microclimate possible. It was the thermal heart of the household, the warm centre around which winter life revolved. The kang was large enough for the entire family to sleep on, but not everyone slept in the same place. The platform had a head and a tail. These were not just metaphorical terms, they described the thermal and social structure of the sleeping arrangement. The head of the kang, called the kangtu, was the section closest to the stove. This was where the hot flues entered the platform. When the kang was fired in the evening, this section heated first and became the warmest. The tail of the kang, called the kang shao, was the section near the chimney. Here, the smoke had already travelled the length of the flue system. It had given up most of its heat. This section was cooler. The temperature difference between head and tail could be 10 or 15 degrees Celsius. The gradient was not sharp. It changed gradually across the length of the platform, but it was noticeable. This gradient was not an accident of design. It was a feature. It allowed the kang to serve different thermal needs simultaneously. Who slept where was determined by a combination of social hierarchy and physical need. In traditional Chinese households, particularly those in rural areas, family structure was organized according to Confucian principles. Respect for elders was paramount. The patriarch and matriarch, or the grandparents if they were still living, held positions of authority. This social order was reflected in the spatial arrangement of the kang. The warmest section, the head, was reserved for the oldest members of the family. Grandparents slept here. If there were no grandparents, the parents took this position. This placement was not arbitrary. Elderly people are more vulnerable to cold. Their bodies generate less heat. Their circulation is often poorer. They feel the cold more acutely and are at greater risk of hypothermia. Placing the elders at the warmest part of the kang was a practical response to this vulnerability. It was also an expression of filial piety, the Confucian value that required children to care for their parents and show them honour. The coolest section, the tail, was occupied by the youngest and most physically resilient members of the family. Children and young adults slept here. This was not seen as a hardship. Young bodies generate heat more readily, they tolerate cooler temperatures better, and they had the warmth of the middle section and the shared quilts to supplement the lower heat from the kang itself. The middle section of the kang was occupied by those in between: adult children, parents if the grandparents were at the head, sometimes extended family members who lived with the household. This arrangement transformed the kang into a physical map of family, relationships. Status and warmth were synonymous. The closer you slept to the stove, the higher your position in the family hierarchy. This mapping was understood by everyone. It was not discussed or debated. It was simply the way things were done. Children grew up sleeping at the tail of the kang. As they aged and as older family members passed away, they gradually moved toward the head. By the time they became elders themselves, they would occupy the warmest position, just as their grandparents had. This progression was a visible manifestation of the life cycle. The kang held multiple generations at once, arranged in order, each occupying the thermal space appropriate to their age and status. But the kang was not just about hierarchy, it was also about proximity. 5 or 6 people sleeping side by side on a platform 3 meters long meant close quarters. There was no privacy, no personal space, bodies touched. This closeness was necessary for thermal reasons as well as spatial ones. The human body at rest produces heat. The exact amount varies depending on size, age, and metabolism, but an average adult generates roughly 75 to 100 watts. A child might produce 50 watts. A family of 5 sleeping together would produce somewhere between 350 and 500 watts of collective body heat. This is equivalent to several incandescent light bulbs. It is not a trivial amount of warmth. Under shared quilts, this heat was trapped. It accumulated in the space between bodies and bedding. The microclimate beneath the quilts became significantly warmer than the surrounding room. The combination of the warm kang surface below and the trapped body heat above created a cocoon. The temperature inside this cocoon might be 25 or 30 degrees Celsius, even when the room air was near freezing. This warmth was not evenly distributed. Bodies closer to the centre of the sleeping arrangement, surrounded by other bodies, stayed warmest. Those on the edges, exposed to the cooler room air on one side, were slightly cooler, but even the edge positions benefited from the proximity. Heat radiated from the bodies in the centre. The quilts trapped this warmth and spread it across the entire sleeping area. Sleeping alone would have meant sleeping colder. An individual body, even on a warm kang, loses heat to the surrounding air. Under a single quilt, that heat escapes more readily. Shared sleeping was not just a matter of limited space. It was a survival strategy. The family became a collective thermal unit, pooling their body heat and using it to supplement the warmth from the kang. This arrangement required trust. It required tolerance of proximity. It meant that the family had to coordinate their sleeping and waking times. It meant that restless sleepers affected everyone. But in the context of a winter that could last 6 months, these were minor inconveniences. The trade-off was clear. Sleep together and stay warm. Sleep apart and risk the cold. The kang, with its gradient of warmth and its capacity to hold the entire family, made this collective survival possible. It was both structure and strategy, a platform of brick and clay that became, each night, a shared refuge from the freezing dark. The quilts used on the kang were not like coverlets. They were thick, heavy constructions designed to trap heat. The outer shell was made from durable cotton fabric, often dyed with indigo. The fabric was tightly woven to resist wind and to prevent the filling from shifting or escaping. The filling itself was cotton, or, in households that could afford it, silk floss. The cotton was not compressed into a dense mass. It was fluffed and layered to create loft, the thickness that traps air. Air is a poor conductor of heat. When trapped in small pockets between fibres, it forms an effective insulating layer. The more loft a quilt has, the more air it traps and the better it insulates. A winter quilt might be 5 or 6 centimetres thick when new. Over time, with use, the filling would compress somewhat, but it still maintained significant thickness. These quilts were large. A single quilt might measure 2 metres by 2.5 metres. This was necessary because it had to cover multiple people. The family did not use individual blankets. They shared 1 or 2 large quilts that draped over all of them. This shared covering had thermal advantages. When multiple bodies are under the same quilt, the heat they generate is pooled. The warm air rising from each person mixes beneath the quilt. This creates a more uniform temperature across the sleeping area than if each person had their own separate covering. The edges of the quilt were tucked in around the perimeter of the sleeping group. This created a seal that prevented warm air from escaping and cold air from infiltrating. On the coldest nights, a second quilt might be added on top of the first. This doubled the insulation and further reduced heat loss. The weight of these quilts was substantial. Lying under them created a feeling of being pressed down, of being held in place. This weight was not uncomfortable. For many it was reassuring. It signalled safety and warmth. The family arranged themselves on the kang after the evening meal. There was no formal bedtime, but as the daylight faded and the oil lamps were lit, activities slowed. The elders took their positions at the head of the kang first. They settled onto the warmest section, sometimes with additional padding beneath them, a folded blanket or a thin mat, to cushion the hard surface. The children and younger adults followed, filling in the middle and tail sections. The arrangement was practiced and familiar. Everyone knew where they belonged. Once everyone was in place, the quilts were pulled up. The family lay on their sides or backs, bodies close together. In the confined space, shoulders touched, feet overlapped. The warmth began to accumulate. Conversation might continue for a while. Quiet talk about the day, plans for tomorrow, stories told by the elders. The dim light from the lamps flickered. Gradually, voices trailed off. One by one, the lamps were extinguished. The room fell into darkness. The darkness inside a yaodong at night was complete. There were no windows to admit moonlight or starlight. The entrance was sealed with the door and its coverings. The only light, if any, came from the faint glow of embers in the stove, visible through the firebox opening. In this darkness, the other senses became more prominent. The sound of breathing, multiple rhythms overlapping, the occasional shift of a body adjusting position, the creak of the kang's wooden frame or the settling of brick. The warmth from the kang radiated upward. It could be felt most strongly through the back and legs, the parts of the body in direct contact with the platform. The quilt trapped this warmth, and the heat rising from the bodies. The temperature beneath the covering climbed. Sleep came gradually. The combination of physical warmth, the weight of the quilts, and the presence of family created a sense of security. The body relaxed, breathing deepened. The kang itself influenced the quality of sleep. The hard surface provided firm support. There were no soft mattresses to sink into, no springs to press unevenly. The body lay flat, weight distributed across a solid plane. This firmness was not universally comfortable by modern standards, but the family was accustomed to it. For them, the kang was simply what a bed was. The warmth also promoted relaxation. A warm environment signals to the body that it is safe to lower its metabolic guard. Muscles release tension. Blood vessels near the skin dilate, allowing heat to distribute more evenly. But the warmth was not excessive. The kang cooled gradually through the night. By morning it might still be detectably warm, but it was no longer hot. This slow cooling meant that the body did not overheat. Overheating can disrupt sleep, causing restlessness and waking. The kang's gradual release of heat kept the temperature in a range that supported continuous rest. The shared sleeping arrangement also meant that if one person woke, they did so in the presence of others. This could be comforting, particularly for children. The quiet breathing of parents or grandparents nearby was a reminder that they were not alone. On very cold nights, the collective warmth was essential. The heat from 5 or 6 bodies, combined with the residual warmth of the kang and the insulation of the quilts, maintained a microclimate that allowed sleep to continue. Without this combination, sleep would have been difficult or impossible. A single person on a cold kang with only one quilt would struggle to stay warm through the night. They would wake frequently, body tensed against the cold, unable to achieve deep rest. But together, the family created enough warmth to sustain themselves. The kang was the foundation. The quilts were the envelope. The bodies were the supplementary heat source. This interdependence was not just thermal, it was social and emotional. The family relied on each other for survival. This reliance was made physical every night on the kang. There was no escaping it. No retreating to separate rooms. No choosing solitude over proximity. The winter demanded togetherness, and the kang enforced it. For the people who lived this way, it was simply normal. They knew no other arrangement. The idea of sleeping alone in a cold room would have seemed strange, even dangerous. The kang, crowded with bodies and heavy with quilts, was home. It was the place where the day ended and the night was spent. It was where warmth was shared, and where, despite the cold pressing in from all sides, sleep was possible. During the day, when the family moved away from the kang to perform tasks outside or in the cooler parts of the yaodong, they relied on clothing to maintain their body heat. Winter clothing in rural northern China was not designed for fashion. It was designed for insulation and durability. The basic garment for both men and women was the mian ao, the padded jacket. This was a long-sleeved coat that extended to the hips or mid-thigh. It fastened at the front with fabric buttons. The construction of the mian ao was methodical. 2 layers of fabric formed the outer shell and lining. Between these layers, cotton or silk floss was inserted. The cotton was prepared carefully. After being harvested and cleaned, it was beaten or carded to separate the fibres and create loft. This fluffed cotton was then laid out in an even layer across the lining fabric. The outer fabric was placed on top, and the 2 layers were stitched together. The stitching was not just at the edges. Lines of stitching ran across the surface of the garment in a grid pattern. This quilting served 2 purposes. First, it held the cotton filling in place. Without stitching, the cotton would shift and clump over time, creating thin spots with little insulation and thick spots with excess. Second, it created chambers within the garment. Each section between the stitching lines held a pocket of fluffed cotton. This distributed the insulation evenly across the entire jacket. The thickness of the padding varied. A typical winter mian ao might have 2 or 3 centimetres of loft. In the coldest regions, or for outdoor work, the padding could be even thicker. The outer fabric was usually a dark colour, indigo blue or dark grey. These colours did not show dirt as readily as lighter shades, which was practical for garments that would be worn daily through a long winter. The closure of the mian ao used a traditional design called earthen. This term refers to the way the front panels of the jacket overlap. The left panel crosses over the right and fastens on the right side of the body. This asymmetric closure creates a double layer of fabric over the chest and stomach. This area contains vital organs and is particularly vulnerable to heat loss. The extra layer provided additional protection. The fastenings themselves were fabric loops and toggles, called pangku. These were made from braided or knotted fabric. They did not use metal buttons. Metal is a good conductor of heat. A metal button exposed to freezing air becomes very cold. When it touches the body, even through layers of clothing, it conducts warmth away from the skin. Fabric buttons do not conduct heat efficiently. They remain closer to the temperature of the body and the surrounding clothing. This small detail mattered in an environment where every bit of warmth had to be conserved. The sleeves of the mian ao were long. In many designs, they extended past the hands. The wearer could pull their hands up into the sleeves, using the fabric as improvised mittens. This was practical for short periods outdoors, or when performing tasks that did not require fine finger control. Keeping the hands covered prevented frostbite and conserved body heat. Below the jacket, the family wore mian ku, padded trousers. These followed the same construction method as the jacket. 2 layers of fabric with cotton filling, quilted to keep the insulation in place. The trousers were loose-fitting, allowing for movement and for air circulation. Tight clothing restricts blood flow and can actually make a person colder. Loose clothing traps air and allows the body to maintain an insulating layer. The trousers were tied at the waist with a fabric sash. At the ankles, they could be tucked into socks or leg wrappings to prevent cold air from entering. In wealthier households, or in regions where sericulture was practiced, silk floss was used instead of cotton for the padding. Silk floss is made from cocoons that cannot be reeled into continuous thread. Double cocoons or damaged cocoons. These are stretched and layered into thin sheets. Silk floss has advantages over cotton. It is lighter for the same amount of insulation. It wicks moisture away from the body more effectively. It compresses less over time. For a garment that would be worn daily for months, these qualities made silk floss a superior material. But it was also more expensive. Most rural families could not afford it and relied on cotton. Footwear was equally important. The feet are far from the core of the body and are particularly vulnerable to cold. Frostbite often begins in the toes. Traditional winter shoes were made from layered cloth, padded and quilted like the clothing. The soles were thick, sometimes reinforced with multiple layers of fabric stitched together to create a durable walking surface. In some areas, felt boots were worn. Felt is made from wool fibres that have been pressed and matted together. It is warm, water-resistant, and durable. Inside the shoes, thick socks were worn. These were often hand-knitted from wool or made from layers of cloth. The head was covered with a padded hat. This might be a simple cap that covered the ears or a more elaborate design with flaps that could be tied under the chin. Heat loss from the head can be significant. Blood vessels near the surface of the scalp radiate warmth. Covering the head reduces this loss and helps maintain overall body temperature. All of these garments were worn in layers. On very cold days, a person might wear 2 sets of padded clothing, one thinner layer beneath, one thicker layer on top. The layering created multiple air pockets, each contributing to insulation. It also allowed for adjustment. If the wearer became too warm from exertion, they could remove the outer layer, but removing clothing was not common. The cold was persistent, and putting garments back on required effort. It was easier to simply tolerate a bit of warmth than to constantly dress and undress. The weight of the padded clothing was noticeable. A full set, jacket, trousers, hat and shoes, might add several kilograms to the wearer's body. This weight required energy to carry, but it also provided a wind-breaking mass that protected the body from the sharp northern gusts. Movement in padded clothing was slower and more deliberate. The bulk of the fabric restricted fine motor skills. Tasks that required dexterity were more difficult, but these garments were not meant for delicate work. They were meant for survival, for fetching water from a well, for feeding animals, for walking to a neighbour's home, for any activity that required exposure to the outside air. When the family returned indoors, they often kept much of their clothing on. The Aodong was not warm by modern standards. It was simply less cold than outside. The padded layers continued to provide insulation even inside. Only at night, when settling onto the kang, did the family remove some of the outer layers, but even then they often slept in lighter padded garments. The quilts provided additional covering, but the clothing beneath served as a first layer of warmth. These garments were cared for carefully. They were mended when stitching came loose. They were aired out periodically to prevent the build-up of moisture and odours. They were stored during the summer and brought out again when autumn turned cold. For a rural family, a set of winter clothing represented a significant investment of time and materials. The garments had to last for years. They were made to be durable, not disposable. The padded jacket and trousers were essential tools. Without them, prolonged exposure to the winter air would lead to hypothermia. With them, the family could continue to function, to work, to survive through the long, cold months. The layers of cotton or silk, the careful stitching, the fabric buttons, the loose fit, all of it was the accumulated knowledge of generations, a system refined through experience, designed to keep the body warm in one of the harshest climates inhabited by humans. Traditional Chinese medicine approached winter survival from a different angle, not through shelter or clothing, but through the body itself. The framework of traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, does not map directly onto modern physiology. It uses different concepts and terminology, but it represents a coherent system developed over thousands of years, and it guided many aspects of daily life, including diet and health practices in winter. In TCM, the body is understood as a system of energies and substances that must remain in balance. One of the fundamental distinctions is between yin and yang. Yin represents qualities associated with coldness, darkness, stillness and moisture. Yang represents warmth, light, activity and dryness. Winter, in this framework, is a yin season. The environment is cold and dark. The days are short. The natural world is dormant. The human body must adapt to this yin environment, but it must not become too yin itself. If the body's yang energy, its warmth and vitality, is depleted, illness and weakness follow. The goal, then, was to support and conserve yang energy during the winter months. This was done through several means. Diet was the most accessible and controllable. Foods in TCM are classified according to their energetic properties. Some foods are considered warming, others are cooling, still others are neutral. These classifications are not about the temperature at which the food is served. They refer to the effect the food has on the body after it is consumed. Warming foods are believed to stimulate circulation, increase metabolic activity, and generate internal heat. Cooling foods are thought to calm the body and reduce excess heat. Neutral foods maintain balance without pushing in either direction. In winter, the diet shifted heavily toward warming foods. Ginger was one of the most important. Fresh ginger, called shengjiang, was used in cooking and also prepared as a tea. It was believed to expel cold from the body and to promote sweating, which was seen as a way to clear blockages in the meridians, the channels through which energy flows in TCM theory. Garlic served a similar purpose. It was considered pungent and warming. It was added to soups and stir-fried dishes. Like ginger, it was thought to stimulate circulation and protect against cold-related illnesses. Other warming ingredients included scallions, leeks, cinnamon, and fennel. These were incorporated into meals whenever possible. Meat, particularly lamb and chicken, was also considered warming. But meat was not a daily staple for most rural families. It was reserved for special occasions or for those who were ill and needed extra nourishment. The foundation of the winter diet was grain, prepared as congee. Congee is a rice or millet porridge, cooked with a large amount of water until the grains break down and the mixture becomes thick and smooth. The cooking process can take an hour or more. This long cooking serves several purposes. It makes the grain easier to digest. Digestion requires energy, and in winter, minimizing the energy spent on digestion means more energy is available for maintaining body temperature. Congee is also warming in the simple physical sense. It is served hot. Eating a bowl of hot congee warms the stomach and core of the body directly. But in TCM terms, congee is also nourishing to the spleen and stomach, the organs responsible for transforming food into energy. A well-functioning spleen and stomach are essential for generating yang energy. Certain ingredients were added to congee to enhance its warming properties. Black beans were common. They were thought to nourish the kidneys. In TCM, the kidneys are not just the physical organs. They represent a functional system associated with the body's foundational energy, called jing. The kidneys are seen as the source of warmth and vitality, particularly in winter. Walnuts were another favoured addition. They were believed to strengthen the kidneys and to warm the lower back, an area particularly vulnerable to cold. Dark leafy greens, though not as warming as ginger or garlic, were included for their nourishing properties. They provided vitamins and minerals that supported overall health. The preparation of food was timed to coincide with the heating of the kang. The stove used to cook the evening congee was the same stove that charged the kang with warmth. This meant that the family received two forms of heat from the same fuel. The food provided metabolic warmth, calories that the body would burn to generate heat. The kang provided environmental warmth, a warm surface to sleep on. The efficiency of this arrangement cannot be overstated. The fire served the meal and the bed simultaneously. Nothing was wasted. Breakfast followed a similar pattern. In the morning, the stove was lit again to prepare the morning congee. This also reheated the kang, which had cooled somewhat overnight. The family ate the warm porridge, providing their bodies with fuel for the day. The kang regained some warmth, making it more comfortable to sit on during the day for work or rest. The TCM approach to winter also emphasized rest. Winter was seen as a time for conservation, not expenditure. The natural world was dormant. Humans should follow this pattern. This did not mean complete inactivity. Work still needed to be done, but unnecessary exertion was avoided. Long walks, strenuous labour, and activities that caused heavy sweating were minimised. Sweating in particular was viewed with caution in winter. Sweat opens the pores. Open pores allow cold to enter the body. Once cold penetrated, it could lodge in the joints or internal organs, leading to pain or illness. Sleep was also emphasised. Longer nights meant more time for rest. The body was encouraged to sleep more in winter than in summer. This conserved energy and supported the kidney's storage of jing. The combination of warming foods, careful energy management, and adequate rest formed a complete strategy for maintaining internal heat. The logic was clear. The environment is cold. The body must generate warmth to survive. Warmth comes from food, which is converted to energy. Energy must not be wasted on unnecessary activity. Rest preserves energy. Warming foods support the organs that generate heat. This framework guided daily choices: what to eat, when to sleep, how much to exert. It was not based on modern scientific understanding of metabolism or thermodynamics, but it was based on careful observation of the body's responses to the environment, accumulated over centuries. The families on the lowest plateau followed these principles not because they had read medical texts, but because the practices were embedded in their culture. They were taught by grandparents and reinforced through repetition. The warming diet, the emphasis on rest, the careful conservation of energy, all of it worked together with the yaodong and the kang and the padded clothing to create a system of survival. Each element supported the others. The yaodong provided stable shelter. The kang provided localized warmth. The clothing provided mobile insulation. The diet provided internal fuel. And at the centre of it all was the body itself, maintaining its core temperature through the long dark months, burning the calories from millet and ginger, resting on the warm brick, wrapped in cotton, surviving. The fuel that burned in the stove each evening did not come from a store. It came from the fields. After the autumn harvest, the land was covered with the remnants of the crops. Stalks of millet and sorghum stood dry and brittle. Corn stalks, thick and fibrous, lay where they had been cut. These materials were not left to rot. They were gathered. Families moved through the fields, cutting the stalks close to the ground and bundling them. The bundles were tied with twine or strips of plant fibre and carried back to the homestead. There they were stacked in dry storage areas. Sometimes these were sheds attached to the yaodong. Sometimes they were simply covered piles arranged against a wall or under an overhang. The goal was to keep the stalks dry. Wet fuel burns poorly, producing more smoke and less heat. Dry stalks ignited quickly and burned cleanly. The quantity of fuel needed for a winter was substantial. A family might gather hundreds of bundles representing days or weeks of labour, but the labour was necessary. Without fuel, the kang could not be heated. Without the heated kang, sleep in the yaodong would be dangerously cold. The stalks were not the only fuel source. Husks from threshed grain were also saved. These were small, light and burned quickly, making them useful for kindling or for boosting a fire that had begun to die down. Dried leaves, twigs, and any other combustible plant matter were collected. In some households, animal dung was used. Dung was collected from livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, and formed into flat cakes. These cakes were left in the sun to dry until they hardened. Dried dung burns slowly and produces steady heat, though it also produces a distinctive odour. For families with animals, dung represented a renewable fuel source. The animals were fed, and they produced dung. The dung was dried and burned. The cycle repeated. But whether the fuel was stalks, husks, or dung, it all came from the same source. The land, the agricultural cycle. The crops were planted in spring. They grew through the summer, drawing energy from the sun and nutrients from the soil. They were harvested in autumn. The grain was eaten. The stalks were burned. The burning released the energy that the plants had captured during their growth. That energy, in the form of heat, was transferred to the kang and used to warm the family through the winter. But the cycle did not end with burning. The combustion of plant matter produces ash. This ash is composed of minerals that the plants absorbed from the soil: calcium, potassium, phosphorus, and others. In a household with a wood stove or fireplace that burned continuously, ash accumulates quickly and is often discarded. But in the rural homes of the loose plateau, ash was not waste. It was collected. Throughout the winter, as the kang was fired each evening, ash built up in the firebox and in the flues. Periodically, this ash was removed to prevent clogging and to maintain efficient airflow. The ash was placed in containers or piled in a designated area. It was kept dry. When spring arrived and the fields were prepared for planting, the ash was returned to the soil. Ash is alkaline. It raises the pH of acidic soils. It also contains potassium, which is an essential nutrient for plant growth. Spreading ash over the fields provided a form of fertilization. This practice completed the loop. The plants grew in the soil. They absorbed minerals. They were harvested. The stalks were burned. The minerals returned to the soil as ash. The next year's plants absorbed those same minerals. The cycle continued. This was not unique to the Les Plateau. Many agricultural societies have used ash as fertilizer, but in an environment where resources were scarce and every element had to be used fully, the practice was particularly important. Nothing was wasted. The stalks that could not be eaten were burned for heat. The heat sustained the family through winter. The ash sustained the crops in spring. The crops fed the family and provided the next winter's fuel. The system was closed, or nearly so. There were inputs, sunlight, rain, the slow weathering of the lower soil itself, but within the household economy, almost nothing left the system. This integration extended beyond fuel and fertilizer. The animals, when kept, were part of the same loop. They were fed on crop residues that could not be burned or were too fibrous for human consumption. They produced dung for fuel. They provided labour for ploughing and transport. When slaughtered, they provided meat and materials for clothing. The yodong itself was part of the system. It was carved from the earth and returned to it. If a yeodong collapsed or was abandoned, the loess would eventually weather and blend back into the hillside. There was no permanent scar, no pile of debris. The clothing, made from cotton or silk grown or produced locally, eventually wore out. The fabric was used for patches or stuffing until it was too degraded. At that point, it could be composted or burned. Even the human body was part of the cycle. When a family member died, they were buried in the earth. The body returned to the soil, contributing its elements back to the system. This perspective, that everything is connected, that waste is simply a resource not yet reused, was not articulated as an environmental philosophy. It was simply how life was lived. The family did not think in terms of sustainability or ecological loops. They thought in terms of survival. They had limited resources. Those resources had to last. Wasting anything meant running short. Running short meant hardship or death. The result, however, was a way of life that functioned in balance with the environment. The family took from the land, less for shelter, soil for crops, plants for fuel. But they returned what they could, the ash, the composted waste, their own bodies eventually. The rhythm of this cycle was annual. Spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, winter consumption. Each season had its role. Winter in this cycle was the season of return. The family burned the stored energy of summer and returned the minerals to the earth. They rested, conserving their own energy, while the land itself rested beneath the frost. The kang, fired each evening with stalks gathered months earlier, was the daily reminder of this cycle. The warmth came from the sun that had shone on the fields in July. The ash that remained would nourish the millet that would grow the following summer. The family slept on the kang, warmed by the energy of the harvest, preparing for the work of the coming year. The cycle turned. The earth gave. The earth received, and in the middle, the family endured. As the evening meal concluded and the family prepared for sleep, one ritual remained: the foot bath. This practice, called pao jiao, was not simply a matter of cleanliness, though that was part of it. It was understood as a therapeutic intervention, a way to prepare the body for rest. In traditional Chinese medicine, the feet hold particular significance. They are described as the roots of the body. They contain a high concentration of acupuncture points, more than 60, and serve as the meeting place for 6 of the body's major meridians. The meridians are channels through which qi, or vital energy, is thought to flow. 3 yang meridians run down the legs to the feet. 3 yin meridians run from the feet up the legs. The feet, then, are critical junctions in the body's energetic system. Soaking the feet in hot water was believed to stimulate these points and meridians. It was thought to nourish the kidneys, which, as mentioned earlier, are associated with foundational warmth and vitality. But beyond the framework of TCM, there were observable physiological effects. Hot water causes the blood vessels in the feet to dilate. This increases blood flow to the extremities. The additional blood carries warmth, and the feet themselves become warm. At the same time, the dilation of blood vessels in the feet draws blood away from the core of the body and the head. This redistribution has a calming effect. Blood pressure drops slightly. The sense of tension or mental alertness decreases. For someone preparing to sleep, this shift is beneficial. The body begins to relax. The mind quiets. The temperature of the water mattered. If it was too cool, it would not produce the desired effect. If it was too hot, it could cause discomfort or even burns. The recommended range was between 38 and 42 degrees Celsius. This is noticeably warm to the touch, but not scalding. Water at this temperature could be prepared by heating it in a pot over the stove and then mixing it with cooler water in a basin until the right temperature was achieved. The family tested the water with a hand before placing their feet in it. The basin was typically a simple wooden or ceramic bowl, large enough to submerge both feet up to the ankles. The feet were placed in the water and allowed to soak. The recommended duration was 15 to 20 minutes. This was long enough for the heat to penetrate and for the blood vessels to respond, but not so long that the water cooled significantly. During the soak, the family might add herbs to the water. The most common was mugwort, called Ai Yi. Mugwort is a plant that grows readily in many parts of China. It has been used in traditional medicine for centuries. In the context of a foot bath, it was believed to warm the channels and dispel cold and dampness. Dampness, in TCM, refers to a pathological condition where excess moisture accumulates in the body. It is associated with joint pain, stiffness, and a feeling of heaviness. The dry, cold climate of northern China could still produce dampness, particularly in areas near water or in poorly ventilated dwellings. Mugwort was thought to counteract this. The plant was dried and then added to the hot water, where it released its aromatic compounds. The scent was sharp and slightly medicinal. Ginger was another common addition. Sliced or crushed ginger root in the water provided a warming sensation that intensified the effect of the hot water. These herbal infusions were not always used. If herbs were unavailable, or if the family chose to conserve them, plain hot water was sufficient. But when herbs were added, they were seen as enhancing the therapeutic effect. While the feet soaked, the body began to relax. The warmth of the water spread upward through the legs. The muscles of the feet and calves, which might have been tense from the day's activities, softened. If the soaking lasted long enough, some people would begin to sweat lightly. This was considered a positive sign. Sweating indicated that the body's yang energy was being activated and that cold was being expelled. After the prescribed time, the feet were removed from the water. They were dried thoroughly with a cloth. This step was important. Wet feet lose heat rapidly through evaporation. In a cold room, this could negate the warming effect of the bath. The feet needed to be completely dry before the person moved away from the basin. Once dry, thick socks were put on immediately. These socks, often made from wool or layered cloth, sealed in the warmth. The feet, now warm and enclosed, would remain comfortable for some time. The person then moved to the kang. The warm feet stepped onto the warm surface of the platform. The combination of the two sources of warmth, the residual heat in the feet and the heat radiating from the kang, created a strong sensation of comfort. This transition from foot bath to kang was designed to maintain and extend the feeling of warmth. The body, already relaxed from the hot water, settled onto the heated platform. The quilts were pulled up. The process of falling asleep began. The foot bath served multiple functions. It cleaned the feet, removing the dirt and sweat of the day. It warmed the extremities, which are often the first parts of the body to feel cold. It promoted circulation and relaxation. It marked the end of the day's activities and the beginning of the transition to rest. For a family living in a cold environment without modern heating, these functions were valuable. The foot bath was a low-cost, low-technology method of improving comfort and supporting health. The practice was also communal. The same basin of hot water might be used by multiple family members in sequence. The eldest would go first while the water was hottest. The youngest would go last. This hierarchy mirrored the arrangement on the kang. Those most in need of warmth, the elders, received the best conditions. Those more resilient, the young, made do with less. But even the youngest benefited. Even water that had cooled to 35 degrees was still warm enough to have an effect. After everyone had bathed their feet, the water was discarded. It might be poured outside or used for some other purpose, washing rags, dampening the earthen floor to keep down dust. The basin was set aside to dry. The herbs, if used, were sometimes saved and reused once or twice before being composted. The entire ritual took perhaps half an hour for the family to complete, but it was time well spent. The transition from the cold, active state of the day to the warm, restful state of night was made smoother. The family climbed onto the kang with warm feet, relaxed bodies, and quieted minds. They arranged themselves in their customary positions. The quilts were pulled up, the lamps were extinguished, and in the darkness, on the warm air platform surrounded by earth, the family slept. The body does not fall asleep instantly. Sleep is a process, a gradual transition from wakefulness to unconsciousness. This transition follows predictable patterns. The heart rate slows, breathing deepens and becomes more regular, muscle tension decreases, brain activity shifts from the alert, focused patterns of wakefulness to the slower rhythms of sleep. For this transition to occur smoothly, certain conditions help. The body's core temperature needs to drop slightly. This is one of the signals that tells the brain it is time to sleep. During the day, core temperature is higher. As evening approaches, it begins to fall. This decline is part of the body's circadian rhythm. The foot bath facilitated this process in a specific way. When the feet are immersed in hot water, blood vessels in the lower extremities dilate. More blood flows to the feet and legs. This blood carries heat away from the core of the body. As a result, the core temperature drops slightly, even as the feet become warm. This redistribution of heat mimics the natural pattern that occurs before sleep. Once on the kang, the family experienced another aspect of this pattern. The surface of the kang was warm, but not hot. It provided enough heat to prevent discomfort, but not so much that it prevented the core temperature from dropping. The combination was ideal. The extremities were warm. The core was allowed to cool slightly. The body interpreted these signals as safe conditions for sleep. The darkness also mattered. Light suppresses the production of melatonin, a hormone that promotes sleep. In the complete darkness of the yardong at night, with no lamps burning and no windows to admit exterior light, the body's melatonin production was unimpeded. The stillness contributed as well. There were no sudden noises, no passing traffic, no mechanical hums or electronic sounds. The only sounds were natural, breathing, the occasional shift of a body on the platform, the faint settling of the structure. This quiet allowed the mind to settle. Without stimulation, attention turned inward. Thoughts slowed. The boundary between waking thought and dream began to blur. The weight of the quilts pressing down on the bodies provided a sense of security. This pressure is calming for many people. It creates a feeling of being held or protected. The proximity of family members also played a role. Humans are social creatures. For most of history, sleeping alone was rare. People slept in groups for warmth and safety. The presence of others nearby can be reassuring at a subconscious level. The sounds of breathing, the warmth radiating from adjacent bodies, the knowledge that others are present, all of this signals safety. On the kang, the family was pressed close together. Children might sleep with their backs against a parent. An elderly person might have a grandchild curled nearby. The contact was constant. This physical closeness facilitated sleep, particularly for the young and old. Infants and small children, who have difficulty regulating their own body temperature, benefited from the warmth of adults. Elderly people, whose sleep is often lighter and more fragmented, were comforted by the presence of others. As sleep deepened, the body passed through different stages. The first stage is light sleep. The person drifts in and out of awareness. They might still hear sounds or feel sensations. If disturbed, they wake easily. The second stage is slightly deeper. The heart rate and breathing slow further. Body temperature continues to drop. The person is less aware of their surroundings. The third and fourth stages are deep sleep. This is when the body performs much of its restorative work. Tissues are repaired, energy stores are replenished, the immune system is strengthened. After deep sleep, the cycle moves into REM sleep, the stage associated with vivid dreams. Then the cycle repeats. A full night of sleep involves multiple cycles, each lasting roughly 90 minutes. On the kang, these cycles proceeded largely uninterrupted. The stable warmth of the platform did not cause sudden waking due to cold. The darkness and quiet did not stimulate alertness. The comfort of shared space and padded quilts supported continuous rest. There were, of course, disruptions. A person might need to rise to urinate. A child might wake crying. Someone might cough or shift position in a way that disturbed others. but these were minor and brief. The overall pattern was one of sustained sleep. The quality of this sleep mattered. Sleep is not just rest. It is when the body and brain recover from the stresses of the day. Insufficient or poor quality sleep leads to fatigue, weakened immunity, and impaired cognitive function. In an environment where physical labour was necessary and where illness could be dangerous, good sleep was essential for survival. The kang, the foot bath, the warmth, the darkness, the proximity, all of these elements combined to create conditions that supported deep, restorative sleep. The family was not conscious of the sleep stages or the hormonal processes or the thermoregulatory mechanisms. They simply knew that they slept well on the kang. They woke in the morning feeling rested. Their bodies were ready for another day. This was the goal. This was what the entire system was designed to achieve. Winter nights were long. Darkness came early and lasted until late morning. This extended period of darkness allowed for extended sleep. The family might sleep for 9 or 10 hours. This was more than they would sleep in summer when the days were longer and work in the fields demanded early rising. But winter had less work. The fields were frozen. Animals required minimal care. There was no urgency to wake at dawn. The extra sleep was beneficial. It conserved energy. The body, at rest, burns fewer calories. In a season when food supplies were limited and every calorie mattered, this conservation was important. Sleep also strengthened the body's defences. The immune system functions more effectively when the body is well rested. In winter, when cold and close quarters increased the risk of illness, a strong immune system was critical. The family slept. The kang cooled slowly beneath them. The earth around the Yaodong held its steady temperature. The wind blew across the plateau, but inside, the family was still. Hours passed. The cycles of sleep turned. Dreams came and went. The body healed and rested. And when morning finally arrived, when the first faint light began to filter through the oiled paper at the entrance, the family stirred. They woke slowly. There was no alarm, no sudden demand to rise. They woke because the sleep was complete, because the body was ready. They emerged from beneath the quilts into the cool air of the Yaodong. The kang was still faintly warm. The day began. The Yaodong was not large by any measure. A typical dwelling consisted of 1 or 2 rooms. The main room, where the kang occupied most of the floor space, might be 4 meters wide and 6 meters deep. This was the family's entire living area through the winter. There was no separate bedroom, no private study, no kitchen distinct from the living space. Everything happened in this one room, or in the small secondary room if the family was fortunate enough to have one. The secondary room, when it existed, was usually used for storage. Grain, tools, extra clothing, items that were not needed daily but had to be kept safe and dry. In some households, this room also served as sleeping space for adult children or extended family members. But it was not heated. There was no kang in the secondary room. It remained at the ambient temperature of the Yaodong, around 10 degrees Celsius. Sleeping there would have been uncomfortable. Most families preferred to crowd together on the single heated kang, rather than split up and subject some members to the unheated space. This concentration of the family into one small area was not just a matter of available space. It was a deliberate strategy. Heating an entire dwelling would require far more fuel than the family had. Even if they burned stalks continuously, trying to raise the temperature of the whole Yaodong to a comfortable level would be nearly impossible. The thick earth walls that provided such excellent insulation also had high thermal mass. Warming that mass would take enormous amounts of energy. And because the Yaodong had minimal active heating beyond the kang, the heat would be lost through the entrance and through slow conduction into the surrounding earth. The solution was not to heat the space, but to heat the surface where the family spent most of their time. During the day, when people were awake and moving, they could tolerate the cool air. They wore their padded clothing. They performed tasks that generated body heat through movement. But at night, when the body is still and generates less heat, and when sleep requires a certain level of comfort, the kang provided a localized zone of warmth. This approach, creating a small warm space within a larger cool space, is far more efficient than trying to warm everything. It is the same principle used by sleeping bags and camping. The bag does not heat the entire tent. It creates a small insulated microclimate around the body. The kang created that microclimate, and by concentrating the family onto the kang, their collective body heat contributed to that zone as well. During the coldest months, the family spent even more time on the kang. Tasks that could be done while sitting or lying down were performed there. Mending clothing, sorting seeds, preparing vegetables for the next meal, telling stories, caring for infants. The kang became the centre of all activity. The rest of the yaodong was peripheral. The family ventured off the platform only when necessary, to cook at the stove, to retrieve something from storage, to go outside briefly. This shrinking of the active living space was a form of energy conservation. Not just fuel energy, but human energy. Movement burns calories. Walking across a cold room uses more energy than sitting still on a warm platform. Every trip off the kang represented a small expenditure of heat and effort. By minimising movement, the family minimised caloric expenditure. This was important because food, like fuel, was limited. The autumn harvest had to sustain the family until the next harvest. There was no grocery store, no ability to buy more food if supplies ran low. The diet was monotonous, congee twice a day, perhaps some preserved vegetables, occasional bits of dried meat or fish. The quantities were sufficient for survival, but there was little excess. Conserving calories meant that the food lasted longer. It also meant that the body did not need to generate as much heat through metabolic activity, which in turn meant less food was required. The logic was circular but sound. Eat less, move less, stay on the warm kang, conserve heat, need less food, eat less. This was not starvation. It was efficiency. The family was not suffering. They were adapting to the constraints of their environment. The psychological effect of this spatial shrinking is harder to measure, but it was likely significant. Spending months in a single small room with the same people day after day required patience and social cohesion. Conflicts were inevitable. Tempers could flare. Small annoyances could become larger grievances. But the family also had no choice. There was nowhere to go, no other warm space to retreat to. They had to resolve conflicts or learn to tolerate them. This enforced proximity likely strengthened family bonds in some cases and strained them in others. The experience varied from household to household. What is certain is that the winter months on the Lest Plateau demanded a level of cooperation and mutual tolerance that modern life, with its separate rooms and individual spaces, does not require. The family was bound together by necessity. The kang was their shared refuge. The yaodong was their shared shelter. They survived together or not at all. As the winter progressed, the boundaries of the world contracted further. Snowfall, when it came, could make travel difficult. Paths between yaodongs became treacherous. Families might go days without seeing neighbours. The social world shrank to the household. The physical world shrank to the yaodong. The warm world shrank to the kang. In this contracted existence, routines became even more important. The predictability of the daily cycle — wake, eat, work on the kang, eat, foot bath, sleep — provided structure and stability. The rhythm was monotonous, but monotony can be comforting. It is predictable. It is safe. The family knew what each day would bring. There were no surprises, no crises, just the slow passage of winter, marked by the gradual depletion of fuel and food stores and the gradual lengthening of daylight. Spring would come eventually. The fields would thaw, planting would begin. The family would move outward again, reclaiming the space beyond the kang, beyond the yaodong. But for now, in the depths of winter, the world was small. The kang was the world, and on that platform of brick and clay, warmed by the burning of last summer's stalks, the family endured.